Welcome to Illuminati Silver. We tell you the truth about silver. Today is Thursday, the 23rd of January 2020. And yesterday we published a video entitled 2020 Investments, Gold, Defence and Utilities. And on Tuesday, a video entitled The Future of the EU, US Dollar and the Euro by Controversially Greg. And on Monday, Peter Schiff loses his Bitcoin wealth, a lesson to us all. And on Sunday, Edward VIII gold sovereign sells for £1 million. Very different videos covering very different topics. And today is no different, in that our subject today is climate change. Now, before anyone asks what has climate change got to do with silver, well, we're asking, and the purpose of this video is to ask, what has climate change got to do with Davos 2020, where world leaders and economic experts are meeting? And this subject is at the top of the agenda. Now, we thought we would go to our climate change expert, whom some may accuse of being a climate change denier, and ask him what the heck is going on. And his reply, needless to say, is somewhat controversial. It's also unfortunately very long, as it's probably one of the best that he has produced so far. So, let's go to it. Greg, are you on the line?
I am indeed.
Now, in the interests of transparency, although this video podcast is going out on Thursday, we are in fact recording this very late Wednesday evening. And the reason I state that is just in case something happens overnight, which is not included in this podcast. Now, Greg, Davos 2020. Climate change. Why is it taking such a prominent role?
There's a hidden agenda here. We are getting lies, compounding lies. We're getting propaganda from every source going. We're getting mythology in overdose, and I really cannot put up a defense for the corrupt concept of forcing everybody down the road of accepting that climate change is man-made and that we can have any material change to it. I can dismantle that argument with the greatest of ease, and I'm perfectly happy to do so. As much as anything, I asked Richard to consider doing this podcast on the basis that this hidden agenda is very hard to establish what it is, and we'd love to hear feedback from our listeners as to why on earth central bankers might be making comments like, and I quote any second now, central banks declare climate change as their core mission at Davos. Why? Where does it come into Davos? How can it affect, other than massively damage, world economies? Because climate change denial is a completely spurious and, I submit, corrupt definition drawn up by the warmists who are promoting this myth of climate change being man-made. They oscillate between trying with the word denial to tie it into Holocaust denial and some sort of great misdemeanor verging on criminal to state that you just cannot be conned into believing mankind is responsible for climate change. It's nothing of the sort. I'm well aware of climate change. I have read a great deal of history over my lifetime. Geology, from Pangaea to Gondwana, the entire concept of plate tectonics, which was denied by, may I quote the very words of the climate change nutters, a consensus of the vast majority of scientists. They said there was no such thing as plate tectonics. We now know for certain that plate tectonics is part of this planet's entire fabric. We know that there was a time in history when there was a consensus of scientists and a consensus of the great religion of the day that the entire universe revolved around the earth. And yet one man, Galileo, was vilified for pointing out that this just wasn't true. He was put under house arrest, although they didn't enforce it much because they knew they were on shaky ground. He was put under house arrest for the whole of the rest of his life to prevent him telling the world the truth. We have the same thing happening with climate change now. Climate change has been omnipresent on this planet for 4.5 billion years. Mankind's only been here for 800,000 years, and it was only 20,000 years ago that we started farming. And it was only about 12,000 years ago that in any numbers we started settled farming. Not very long when you think 12,000 years of farming relative to 4.5 billion years of climate change. Mankind has had not just an insignificant, but totally irrelevant effect on the planet's climate. It is a complete fabrication. The problem is, can any of our audience tell me why it is being fabricated? We are getting people saying that it's appalling to, they quote again, deny climate change. I'm not denying climate change. I'm the very first to say we're aware of something like 28, 29 ice ages from our geological record. I'm the very first to say that we actually have at the moment a relatively low level of CO2 because you can measure back as long as you do it over an intelligent period, not effectively the last 20 seconds of history, which is what things like the IPCC base their figures on. They take it back to the 1700s. Well, that's not part of the record. That's a photograph of a sort of tiny, 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 tiny wee blip of history. We know that we were in a mini ice age in the 1700s, which of course is conveniently left out of all the figures. We know that we still had the Thames freezing over in the 1850s. So now we look at Christmas cards of stagecoaches axle deep in snow that came about from the image of Christmas in Europe and St. Nicholas. And this was the image of the mid to late 1800s. Yes, there has been a gradual change in climate, but it's always changing. Interestingly, over the last 18 years, the temperature of the Atlantic has dropped by 2 degrees in this period of great global warming. Yes, other areas of the planet have gone up. We have climate cycles. Yes, they continue on an ongoing basis. The entire temperature of this planet and life surviving on this planet has for 4.5 billion years developed, although life is a very modern concept. It has developed as a result of being sustained by our local star. We happen to be in orbit, an orbit which changes shape, I might end, over long periods of time. And we happen to be on a tilted planet, which has a tilted axis with a huge deposit of iron in the molten core of the planet, of which we're aware, a molten core of iron that moves within the center of the planet, giving rise to the movements of magnetic north, which is currently moving at approximately 32 miles per annum, shifting from what was seen as the North Pole towards the North Siberian coast at the moment, this very moment. The one where global warming is a disaster, so we're being told. If global warming is such a disaster, can somebody explain why what is it called? Prince Haakon icebreaker of Norway, a brand new icebreaker, was forced to turn back with it in July due to ice at the towards the Arctic. Endlessly, we're being told complete lies about climate change. People then point out, but what about the fires in the Amazon? Well, they have nothing to do with climate changing one way or the other. In fact, the number of fires this year is the lowest for 15 years because they are accurately recorded by satellite. The lowest fire level for 15 years in the Amazon basin. Yet we've had nothing but publicity of how the Amazon is burning away. No, less than most years. Then, when they realized that was starting to fail, we have the fires of Australia, which must, of course, be due to climate change. No, they're not due to climate change at all. May I ask why the early European settlers, when they arrived at Australia, didn't ask a few intelligent questions? They could start with the question, why are there so few people in this huge continent? They could follow that up with, why are the people here all nomadic? They could then do a little bit more investigation and decide how many thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, had it taken many of the plants in Australia to evolve in such a manner that they only germinate as a result of fire. Why didn't they ask why the name for what is called the whistling hawk and also another called the black hawk, why they are called by the Aborigines, the indigenous peoples of Australia, they are called the firebirds? Well, it's quite simple. During the dry season, when it is quite difficult for birds of prey to find small reptiles, small mammals on which to prey, the black hawk and the whistling hawk will fly anything up to 20 miles at the sight of smoke. They will fly directly to the fire that is burning on the ground because they know that as the grass burns away, as the leaves burn away, as the twigs burn away, small mammals and small reptiles flee from the front line of the fire. This provides a restaurant for these hawks. Here is a mass of prey, and literally hundreds of these birds will fly in from up to 20 miles away, fly in to this super restaurant that has been opened for them. But the reason they're called firebirds isn't just because they are attracted by the food that is available around the edges of that fire, but if the fire looks as if it's burning out, they will pick up burning sticks and they will fly with them to another area where there is dry grass that acts as tinder, and they will drop the sticks into that to start another fire and thereby open up another hawk restaurant. Now, how many thousands of years does it take for birds to evolve learning that skill? We hear endlessly that there is a consensus of opinion of scientists. This is an unmitigated lie. 31,500 scientists, for starters, all with qualifications in the field of climate, geology, and records, accordingly, have all stated that the IPCC report, commissioned by the United Nations, is scientific bunkum. And that was stated in the Oregon Declaration. Time and again, learned professors, highly qualified scientists working independently are stating that the results produced and the conclusions drawn by the IPCC report, which is now, I think, in its 7th amendment, as people keep proving bits of it wrong, is just not science. There is a statement that there's a consensus of opinion amongst scientists. No, there is a purchased opinion amongst scientists who are reliant on grants. You can get scientists to prove anything you want them to, just as in Britain, our Chancellor, prior to the present government, in Cameron's government, a chap by the name of Osborne, who is now, astonishingly, a newspaper editor, which makes 2 jobs he's not qualified for, in my opinion. He commissioned from the Treasury, the British Treasury, a report to prove that Brexit would be a disaster for Britain. So what did the Treasury do? They produced a report that said Brexit will be a disaster for Britain, just as Mark Carney, the director of the Bank of England, stated again and again that the pound would fall, the interest rates would go sideways, all our assets would be seized, they would shut down banking in London, everything under the sun. So much so that it would appear that in embarrassment, he's quitting his job on the 31st of January, I believe. And what is he doing now? Oh, he's promoting climate change. Well, that's a bit of a volte-face, isn't it? From head of the Bank of England, a Canadian, to all of a sudden promoting climate change, because that's the latest fashion buzzword for the charlatans and shysters in governance. Sorry, tell me I'm wrong, but show me where I'm wrong. Everything you put forward, I believe I can put forward 10 far more convincing and detailed arguments.
Well, Greg, on that, one person, one very unlikely person who will agree with you and has actually stated so at Davos, and that is President Donald Trump. The headlines today state, and I'll quote them to you, US President Donald Trump has decried climate prophets of doom in a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where sustainability is the main theme. He called for a rejection of predictions of the apocalypse and said America would defend its economy. Mr. Trump did not directly name the teenage climate activist Greta Thunberg, who was in the audience. Later, she excoriated political leaders, saying the world, quote, in case you hadn't noticed, is currently on fire, unquote.
Name a fire that's due to climate change. Just one would do.
What is interesting, though, Greg, and you've hit the nail on the head, Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England, now a climate change advocate. Even today, well, I should say yesterday, but we're publishing the video today, Pedro Sanchez, Prime Minister of Spain, highlighted in a speech at the Economic Summit Forum that some of the major challenges Spain and the rest of the world are facing are climate change, gender equality, and taxation. And he reminded the audience that economic growth at any cost is not acceptable. Why are these bankers, prime ministers, economic experts all advocating climate change? I can understand scientists being paid and therefore coming up with this solution. And we all believe that the hidden agenda is an alternative form of taxation on the public, as opposed to what is visibly seen as direct taxation. But why are the bankers getting involved?
Basically, it's my opinion that they are merely prostitutes to their jobs. Nothing more. They're being paid to in one way or another. We notice at the moment, on a global scale, that people of power and wealth are finding ways to not pay their taxes. Whether that is organizations like Amazon or the various tech organizations, whether that is people like Donald Trump, who refuse to supply even their own government with the truth about their taxes and their income. Whether it is by fiddling taxes to blackmail other countries. There is a general reticence over taxation. Huge percentage of Americans consider tax to be fundamentally unlawful and dishonest and set up for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. And it's hard in many ways to disagree with them. Many in America resent the concept of social assistance of any sort. If you're disabled, that's just tough, mate. If you're ill, bad luck. It's your problem. Until, of course, it happens to them. But this starts to explain, possibly, the warped logic of these failed institutions, in that they are dependent on taxation as the salaries of politicians rise exponentially, and there are more and more of them as government gets bigger at the expense of national success. There are more and more parasitic bankers pretending that they are the great enablers who provide the finance. No, they don't. They haven't got any goddamn money. Every time they hit a blip, they have to be bailed out. We saw that with the banking crash and years of austerity to pay off the massive debts that have been created in bailing out their chums in the banks. Now, the banks can't turn their back on the hand that fed them in their time of need, and the politicians are in the embarrassing position of, to put it bluntly, having made a total horse's ass of the management of populations, a complete cock-up of international economics, have increasingly become dependent on being grubby little arms dealers on a national basis, supplying and hoping for warfare to need armament to keep their economies going. And we all know the countries around the world where this is the bedrock of their commercial viability. Having made such a mess of it, they need an element of fear to manipulate, manage, control, and tax their people. What better fear than you'll fry alive by 2030? You won't. It ain't happening. Yes, the temperature may be varying. It is more likely, statistically, taken on the historic record, to be moving towards an ice age than, in fact, moving towards dangerous heat worldwide. We hear that Antarctica has shed umpteen trillion tons of ice from the glaciers around its edge. Have you ever heard a figure of how many tons of ice over that same period have been formed in the center of Antarctica from falling snow? And the formation of ice is losing that many trillion tons of ice nothing more than cyclical change as a result of the reduction of sunspots on the sun, but it is still forming more ice. What is the balance between the new ice created and the old ice shed. Glaciers creep inexorably towards the sea, or inexorably downhill until they get to the sea, and then they, as they call it, calve, shedding ice off of their tip. But more ice is being created at the source of the glacier. We look at Greenland, where many of the glaciers are at the moment growing. It was called Greenland because in the days of the Vikings, which isn't very long ago, when you think that the Vikings existed at the time that America was first being inhabited by human beings, and they were farming in Greenland. Note, the clue as to what the climate was like is in the name, green. Then we have the Northwest Passage. I may be out by a couple of years, but I think it was 1922 and 1946 and 48. 1922, it was Slocum who took a sailing boat from east to west through the Northwest Passage, which is effectively from Greenland in the North Atlantic to the Bering Straits between Alaska and Russia. And it was done again in 46, but that time I think it was west to east, and again in 48, at which time it was from east to west again. It was the Northwest Passage because you could sail across it, but you haven't been able to do that in recent years because there's been too much ice. This is what happens when you get global warming. It would appear more ice.
Where perhaps, and I'm going back to the summit now, where perhaps this view can feed through, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which way one looks at it, in terms of practical implementation. I'll give you an example. Goldman Sachs has now declared that it will no longer fund new investments in Arctic oil or in coal for power stations. And the head of the investment company BlackRock has defined climate change as the biggest threat to markets.
You cannot call them an investment company.
Okay, but
they're a subsidized junk market for money.
They are, but they've defined climate change as the biggest threat to
I don't care what they defined it as. They couldn't run a bank to save a piss up in a brewery. The stake they got in, and the British taxpayer had to bail out these crooks.
Tackle the effect that Goldman Sachs not lending to oil companies or coal power stations could actually have.
Isn't it amazing that oil companies that are highly profitable organizations, and coal, which is a little bit passé as a fuel because it's not very efficient and bears no subsidies and doesn't suit governments at the moment, they're withdrawing from a market that doesn't need their money, basically. And when they say they are not going to fund oil development in the Arctic, well, I don't think America as a country needs funding by peanuts of a bank that is dependent on being propped up by governments every time it hits a bump in the road. And when it comes to the crunch, the oil field off of Gull Island, north of Alaska, there are two so far identified, both of them independent of each other, are believed to contain reserves of oil that independently each exceed the Saudi oil fields. Let's not forget, America now is arguably the world's largest producer of oil. It needs to make very little effort to be totally self-sufficient in oil. Goldman Sachs is probably very wise not to take America on head to head. Quick, find another area to invest. Now, as a point of interest, what fuel are they planning on investing? Nuclear fusion, nuclear fission? Because nobody but a nutter would invest in wind turbines, and nobody but a nutter would invest in solar panels. And you've got to be stone mad to think that electric automobiles are a viable concept. They're a joke. Do you know how many wind turbines you would need to erect in Britain to supply the electricity, to supply electric cars? You wouldn't be able to drive around in the gaps between the bloody wind turbines. It's just not a viable concept. And when it comes to ecological damage, not only are wind turbines a disaster, but what the hell do you do with a dead wind turbine once its time expired? What do you do with the 250 litres of oil in the motor? What do you do with the diesel generator that is quietly secreted at the bottom of the wind turbine for when the wind isn't strong enough to blow the turbine? What do you do with the hundreds of tons of iron reinforcing rebar that is in the hundreds of tons of concrete which form the plinth on which the wind turbine stands? Has anybody set aside any money to actually, for lack of a better term, aswasify the land and dismantle the wind turbine that is no longer producing because its time expired? And have they decided how they will recycle and reclaim the copper wire that's in the windings of the generator? Have they the vaguest idea how they will recycle, or for that matter, pay to recycle, spent solar panels, or what they will do with the obscene amount of rare earth chemicals that are required in solar panels and automotive electric car batteries? They just aren't telling people the truth. Electric cars are great for kiddies' toys at Christmas until you run out of batteries. Not on.
We have just 3 minutes left, and I just want to reveal to our listeners some conversations I've had with colleagues of mine who are still in the banking business, because we started off this podcast asking why are bankers at all interested in this subject. And the response I've been given by a number of them, and let me finish without interrupting, please, because it's only going to be a few sentences. The first is that the banks are lending to businesses and are very concerned, allegedly, that those businesses, by not adopting a beneficial carbon footprint, could find, through peer pressure or pressure exerted by governments on them, could find that a number of governmental and eventually private sector contracts will dry up and those businesses will fail. And the banks do not wish their loans to fail. Secondly, I can reveal that most of the world's largest banks now, today, as we speak, have small teams of staff who are trying to calculate how the assets on their balance sheet are allegedly contributing to global warming. And what that basically means is they may very well write down those assets if they feel that those companies could be exposed. Because the myth or the reality, depending which way one looks at it, is that come 2040, they feel that humanity could see food scarcity, mass migrations, and not just economic, but social instability. And therefore, they need to protect their assets. Any comment on that, Greg, before we finish?
Yeah, two quick comments. In the 1860s, at the rate of growth of transport in the City of London, a report was produced. The roads of London were going to be completely impassable by the turn of the century due to the depth of horse manure. That was one fear that never came right. But there was still a very, very strong argument for basically the end of the world as we knew it because of horse shit. And I think most of this is a crock of horse shit. And at the end of the day, I well remember when we were reading reports when I was a youngster that due to the burgeoning number of people on the planet, there would be starvation by the year 2000, and starvation worldwide. Well, as a point of interest, we produce more food nowadays than have ever been produced in the whole of history. And we are in a situation where if everybody on the planet died yesterday, everyone currently on the planet died yesterday, more people would have died yesterday than have ever existed on the planet in the whole of history. It is very easy to lie with statistics, and no one is better at that than bankers and the crooks in politics.
Well, Greg, on that note, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We hope you have found this video interesting and informative, and if so, please give it a thumbs up and share it on social media. Please ensure that you have subscribed to our channel and press the bell sign so that you are notified of any future videos. Also, kindly visit our website at illuminatisilver.com, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe either as a free or paying member for regular email updates and offers. Disclaimer: Illuminati Silver owners come from a background of banking, international wealth management and economics. Having now retired from these worlds, we are not qualified to give investment advice. Therefore, this and other productions must not be deemed to be giving such advice and merely represent the personal views of its owners.